There's a bill being proposed to protect Uber and Lyft drivers and increase the pay. And I'm hoping this has a huge ripple effect everywhere else around the country. First off, unless you live in Minnesota, unfortunately, this only applies to Minnesota. However, I can see this having a huge effect on other states and just the way we view ride-sharing in general. But as you can see right away, it is meant to protect workers for rideshare companies like Uber and Lyft. The two companies claim it actually threatens how much drivers earn. I'm going to say it right away, BS. I will talk about this a little bit later in this video about Prop 22. Something similar, not 100%, but kind of similar, happened here in California. And as you can imagine, Uber and Lyft said, oh, no, it's not going to be good for drivers. Now we realize, looking back in hindsight, that what happened with Prop 22 here definitely screwed over a lot of drivers. So I want to say that right away, kind of ignore what Uber and Lyft says in a lot of these cases. But here's the thing. He goes, let's say for one driver, I was thinking about, am I going to come back safely and see my family, right? Talking about maybe potentially issues with the dangers of driving. I've never really done a video about that, but it's true. Statistically speaking, the more that you're on the road, the more likely you are to get into an accident. Things like deactivation, low wages, this goes on and on. So what's his name? I just skipped it right here. Iyad Ali, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, formed the Minnesota Uber and Lyft Drivers Association. I think that's huge, which now has more than 1,200 members. They're fighting for wage increases, better insurance coverage, and protections against being fired, along with minimum rates, according to Ali's lawyer. And I think this is huge, right? I mean, I've done so many videos about the pay issues, legal issues. Being a rideshare driver now has just gotten worse. There's no other way to word that, right? And going down here, the amount that they're being paid has gone down to about half, and the expenses have gone up, so they're left with almost nothing, says his lawyer. We all know this, right? I mean, this is ridiculous. However, this is where things get kind of annoying, right? So talking about the bill, it's the most basic essential bill yet. It says compensation rates of $1.85 and 25 cents, which goes down if a rider is closer. So depending on the type of ride, certain rates will fluctuate. But then Lyft says it will make the ride so expensive, fewer people could afford them. I'm going to be honest, I think that's BS. I mean, there might be some slight truth to it. What I've noticed, like I said, what happened here in California, when there's a slight truth to something like this, Uber and Lyft aggressively exaggerate it to make sure people vote against something like this. Same thing happened here in LA, not just LA, but California. I can't remember what it was, but I think Uber spent something like $30 million, something ridiculous in terms of ads, so people would vote that rideshare drivers stay as independent contractors here. And when I talk to most drivers here, they hate that they're actually still independent contractors. Back in the day, a lot of drivers were like, no, I want to stay as an independent contractor. Now we realize, yeah, Uber and Lyft just kind of screwed over drivers, right? Going down here, Uber says as of Monday morning, 300 drivers I'm going to put this in quotation marks, email lawmakers asking them to oppose the bill. Again, I hate to say this, but I think this is very manipulative on Uber's part. Yes, there might be some slight, small truth to what Uber and Lyft is saying about the negative aspects. Remember, no bill's perfect, but I think this is just very manipulative. I think they're just trying to convince drivers saying, no, you don't want this because of blah, blah, blah. But this is huge, I mean, in the statement, we've asked legislators to work with us to pass a bill that raises rates for drivers without doubling the cost for riders. I don't know. I mean, it is tough to say, right? The governor has not committed to signing the bill, and he says it's unlikely it will pass this session, which expires in May 22nd. At the exact time of this video, this is in 2 days, right? But I agree with this. The new economy, especially around the gig economy, we have to think about these workers. It's something I think a lot about, and I think there's a lot more conversations to happen, and there's a lot more advocate groups that I think need to be at the table. And I agree with this, so right here, Uber and Lyft drivers are considered independent contractors. They're not eligible for benefits like sick time and family leave, and a lot more. I mean, that's scraping the iceberg right there. And if it passes, it goes on to the Senate. Like I said, this could have a massive ripple effect depending on what happens. And they just kind of argue about random stuff here and there. But here's the big kicker for me when it comes to all of this. And that is, I don't like what Uber and Lyft is doing. Like I said, when this happened in California, and history repeats itself, as we all know, when this happened in California, Uber and Lyft did a lot of work to convince drivers, not just riders, but mostly drivers, I noticed, you should not want to be an employee. You want to be an independent contractor. The main selling point is when they're like, oh, you're going to make less money, blah, 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 BS. No driver's making that much money right now. Well, like I mentioned, I'll take a step back. Like I mentioned in other videos, I've noticed this huge spread where there's not that much of a middle section of drivers. I find 75% of drivers make almost nothing, horrible wages, and of course, we all know costs are going up in terms of living, gas, maintenance on your car, etc. 25% of drivers are making excellent money, which I know blows most drivers' minds on this channel. Yes, there are a lot of drivers I've talked to, I've interviewed that are making insane money, but for most drivers, they're not doing that well, right? And going back to Prop 22, Uber and Lyft was arguing, oh, you're gonna make less money. In addition, you don't have that flexible schedule, which, let's be honest, for most people in the ride-sharing world, the flexible schedule is, I'd say, 90% of the reason why most people drive for Uber and Lyft. You can start whenever you want, stop whenever you want, especially, like, say, if you have other jobs, other obligations, you can kind of work around it, et cetera, et cetera. However, and I mentioned this before, I worked when I was in Boston for another company that was like a gig type of company. I was an employee, and I also had a flexible schedule. And so it's like their main argument of saying, oh, well, if you're not going to be an independent contractor, you can't have a flexible schedule. It's just going to cost Uber and Lyft more, which is why they're saying, all right, we're going to make up some excuse or whatever. No, you could definitely work on a flexible schedule if you are an employee. I did it in Boston. So yeah, so I do want to say that, but talking more about Prop 22, because this happened a while ago, it convinced a lot of drivers and some people who maybe didn't know better, saying, oh, we're going to keep drivers as independent contractors. It's better for everybody. Most drivers I've interviewed, 90, maybe even 95% of them now, when I ask, so curious, after Prop 22, are you happy about staying as an independent contractor? Almost every driver said, no. I'm an independent contractor. I've even had some drivers say, yeah, I did vote for it. I wanted to make sure I was an independent contractor. Now I realize it gave Uber and Lyft more power to screw us over more. And that is a huge issue. Now I'm hoping with this bill, things get better. Like I said, I think any single time, this is what's weird about America that's very bittersweet, to be honest, depending on the situation. You have state laws and state rules and federal laws. Even, I know a lot of people, I have friends who live in other countries and they're like, Mark, I don't get it. How come, weed is, I think, a really good example, actually very similar to this in an odd way, which I'll talk about. How come weed is legal in Colorado or California, yet is illegal federally? Like, how does that even work? And I'm like, honestly, most people don't even really know. It's kind of one of those weird gray areas. And oddly enough, I do look at this very similar to that, to like weed or marijuana. For me personally, I gotta be honest, not my thing, right? I definitely prefer alcohol more. I don't think I've ever talked about it in a video. I mean, it's kind of a side note. I have a lot of friends who smoke. Personally, not my thing, but it is kind of a similar trend where I noticed, at first there was a talk about it being decriminalized. And then it became legal in Colorado and Washington, I believe, was the start. And then other states. And then slowly becoming more decriminalized in other states, and it's moving. And I think it's very, very, with looking at the trend, it's very possible in a year or two or whenever that's going to be fully legal pretty much everywhere in America, right? And in a very similar way, when it comes to ride sharing, this discussion of riders getting more protection, getting protection when it comes to wages and insurance coverages, and being deactivated randomly. I talked before in Chicago, there was talk about creating a bill and a policy where if Uber and Lyft deactivated you randomly and in a way that was kind of messed up, I know it's probably for lack of a better phrase, where they're just like, yeah, we're going to deactivate you, and then later they realize, oh yeah, you were actually okay, you did nothing wrong, that they have to kind of back pay you or retroactively give you money. So there's been talk in all these different states and areas now more about this discussion of independent contractors versus employees. There's been a lot more talk about protecting rideshare drivers. So I think this bill is just another one to show that there is way more now activity, I think, for a lot of drivers saying, hey, we're done with being screwed over. We're done being treated like this. It is ridiculous. As we all know, when it comes to rideshare drivers, I think Uber and Lyft have this policy that they're like, hey, even if you don't get paid that much and you get deactivated or you stop working, who cares? We'll just get another driver. We all know this, that Uber and Lyft favors passengers or riders way more than drivers. That's why I've mentioned in other videos as pro tips, which is kind of an unfortunate pro tip, but a truth for one. If, let's say, you have a dispute with a passenger, always contact Uber and Lyft first, because Uber and Lyft will typically favor the passenger side. And like I mentioned too, when it comes to the whole Chicago policy, they might just deactivate your account and then later be like, oh, we're sorry. Yeah, we realized it actually was the passenger's fault. Sorry about you missing out on 2 weeks of work or whatever. So I think this is a good bill, and I'm hoping it goes through. But even if it doesn't, I hope this bill kind of is one of those big stepping stones, or another one of these stepping stones for maybe some unionization to happen, in terms of creating an Uber and Lyft union or a ride-sharing union. Basically something along the lines that just protects drivers more. This is something we need, and I think that although there has been like almost mini activity, if I call it that, here in California, then in Minnesota, then in Chicago. I think New Jersey had some stuff going on too, in all these different areas. I'm hoping that there becomes some type of even potentially federal thing or policy or just something in place that does protect drivers more, give them the wages that they deserve, makes things better when it comes to insurance coverages. If you get into an accident, if something happens, God forbid, just protects people all across the board, because we all know with things getting worse with rideshare driving, this is something that's definitely important. And like I said too, I don't like that Uber and Lyft, there's some pros and good things about Uber and Lyft. I will say that, I've talked about that in other videos, that there's a lot of benefits about Uber and Lyft. But one of the things that they do that's really messed up to me among a lot of things is this. I think it's very manipulative for them to go to drivers and kind of give them maybe the half truth, or take, like I said, a small truthful thing, but then exaggerate it or do whatever they can to convince drivers not to do this. Because as you can imagine, the only reason why Uber and Lyft does not want these policies to pass is because it will cost them more money, and they won't be able to screw drivers over as much, right? They'll be maybe held accountable a lot more. This is definitely a huge issue, and I'm hoping that this is a good step in the right direction, because drivers need a lot more protection.